we're going back to the heart of the conference in that sense. So Ways of Caring, Practicing Solidarity sort of sprung to life in January 2021, when Professor Daniëlle Bruggeman and a team of theorists and practitioners began exploring how to practice solidarity in fashion. This came in response to the COVID-19 outbreak, of course, and an ongoing conversation after having heard many calls for solidarity, a more solidary fashion system, and more solidary practices of making and wearing. I'd like to invite Daniëlle to the stage and take us with her on the journey she initiated with the Fashion Professorship of ArtEZ University. A warm welcome to Daniëlle. Well, we've already seen her, but... So, for those of you who don't know, the Fashion Professorship explores and develops critical fashion theories, critical theories and practices of making, wearing, and embodying fashion. In doing so, the Fashion Professorship aims to contribute to practicing alternative and solidary systems with more agency for human beings in precarious positions and more care for all living beings. Daniëlle, the floor is yours. Will you take us on your journey?
Yes, thank you so much, Theodore, for this wonderful introduction. I will stay here. Initially, we thought, well, maybe we'll be sitting there, but we thought, no, this is a democratic setting. I think it's much better to really stay in this democratic setting and have a conversation together. You already introduced, well, how these research projects started, and indeed, the last 24 hours, we heard so many valuable perspectives on solidarity in relation to fashion and ways of caring. And what we wanted to do is to share some of our ideas that we developed in the course of developing these research projects over the last year. We initiated 2 research projects, actually, but both on solidarity. Actually, I wanted to acknowledge everyone who has been participating and contributing to these research projects physically. So it was an idea of Margreet Sweerts and Saskia van Drimmelen. And I would like to invite all participants of these research projects to stand up and to raise your arm. So everyone who was involved, please show us who you are. And yeah. Just to acknowledge everyone's contribution, because everyone will be part of today's program in different ways. So some of us are part of the panel conversation now. Some of us have mini expos outside. We have some workshops in the afternoon, etc. Yes, and indeed, you already introduced the content very well, I think, as a response to the non-solidary strategies of how the current fashion industry operates, like exploitation, alienation, non-transparency, the systemic inequalities, etc. And this is when we invited a group of critical fashion practitioners, artists, designers, researchers to come together and to do practice-based research and exploring what are then more solidary ways of making and wearing clothes and doing fashion. And what does practicing solidarity actually mean? Solidarity with whom or with what? And what does it mean to be solidary with each other, with non-human beings, with animals, with the earth? And how should we learn to do so? And what should we unlearn? And what are maybe the conditions that we should create to perform a more solidary behavior also on the long term? So these questions were the starting points of our research projects. And I will now introduce the participants of our panel conversation. I will start the conversation by asking a couple of questions. But please know that it's very much open for all of your contributions as well. So I will start with some guiding questions, and please feel free to respond to each other and to really make this into a conversation. Thank you. First, I will introduce Sanne Karsenberg, researcher and practitioner at the intersection of art, design, textiles, and fashion. Andrea Jihad Baru, sitting over there, critical fashion practitioner, member of the Not Enough Collective and co-curator of the State of Fashion Biennial. Zinzi de Brouwer, sitting right here, fashion practitioner and researcher and founder and creative director of Studio Palja and head of society and context at the Amsterdam Fashion Institute. Aurélie van de Peer, sitting right there, writer, fashion scholar and lecturer, and holds a PhD in philosophy and sociology. And in addition to the contributors of this project, we invited Louise Croff Blake, who is a trans non-binary designer, artist, research and writer, and community organizer, working with queer methodologies through design. And from the US originally, now based in Berlin. Thank you for contributing to this conversation. My first question was actually to Andrea, also being the co-curator of the Fashion as Encounters exhibition. Could you reflect a bit on the theme of the State of Fashion Biennial, Ways of Caring, and the issues that you aim to address in the exhibition that you co-curated called Fashion as Encounters in relation to the theme of solidarity?
Thank you, Daniëlle, Theodore, and everyone here. I think for us, the 7 co-curators working in the Biennial Ways of Caring, is really about practicing the actions that are behind what care means, in a way that means to listen, to imagine, to ask, to reflect, to celebrate, to embrace, to coexist. And we really wanted within the Biennial to bring as many visions as we could. We know it's not possible to bring all of them, but also to invite as much as people we could, and we really managed to invite a lot of people. And also, yeah, to, I don't know, to smell different things, to also feel and encounter different sensibilities within. And yeah, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that within the Biennial, of course, we are only presenting very few ways of caring. And there are many more, and this is also work that has been done for years for people we don't even know. And in relation to the exhibition Fashion as Encounters, I think, as we also discussed many times within the practicing solidarity meetings, I think the way we practice then caring within the exhibition was really giving attention to topics that are often neglected from the big fashion industry or the big fashion system, and yeah, invite people to tell different narratives, but also it's not only about the people that are exhibiting, but also trying to invite that people that may feel rejected from fashion. Just by walking on a street and feeling rejected by other bodies that make you feel that you don't belong to. And 2 things I want to mention within the exhibition are like, if many of the people we invited to exhibit are not related to fashion at all. So we had so many interesting conversations with them to also convince them that they should join into this conversation, because it's not only about fashion itself. And also, yeah, it was very interesting how the co-creators within their 4 months of work, they worked together in an online setting with very different time schedules, with very different visions, and that was, I mean, and in relation to solidarity then, and coming back to the question, I think they really prove how that they were very respectful and in the way they related to each other. And I think then coming back from the beginning of making the curatorial vision within the 7 of us, we never really, in my perspective, maybe I don't remember, but I don't think we actually mentioned solidarity in the beginning of the process at all. I think it is something that came organically in the practice when we started installing, when we started building, and when the volunteers were there, are still here every day working with other people that we don't see or we don't mention are working there, and yeah, it is also, I think, important to mention that there are, of course, many ways of practicing solidarity, and I don't think practicing solidarity in fashion is different from practicing solidarity in other practices. And in that way, I also would like to mention that I think it's very important to realize that for other people and other territories, solidarity is not even an option, but they have to be solidarity between each other in order to resist and to be alive. And in the context of Arnhem and in the context of the Biennale specifically, I think the way we show solidarity to each other within this project is like we are all here being kind with each other, respecting each other, and with curiosity towards each other, and working for a big same aim in that way. Sorry if I extended, but there was a lot to say.
Thank you. No, these are all very important points, so thank you for mentioning these. Yeah. In our research project, we often indeed discussed the importance of opening up space for unheard voices, and starting from marginalized perspectives when trying to develop more solidary practices of making and wearing. And I'm going to Zinzi now, because I think you also have interesting thoughts to add and to share in relation to this. So I was wondering if you could indeed share your thoughts about the importance of doing so, also based on your own practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to mention that my research and my practice deals a lot with ethnographic deepenings into kind of marginalized communities and marginalized voices. And for this research these past few months, and I was in Mozambique for it, thankfully, it gave me the opportunity to really delve into kind of the theorizations of bell hooks, who's a huge inspiration for my research. And she talks a lot about the marginalized discourse, or the marginal discourse. And for me, this raises the question on who is at the center and who is at the margin, and why. And she eloquently says to be at the margin is to be part of the whole, but outside of the main body. And this really rings true to me, and in my experience working with indigenous communities and marginalized women and children, because the center is not a neutral location. And we have to ask ourselves what kind of discourse is the norm at the center. And I think, Steven, you touched upon this in your opening talk, which is who are we listening to? And Bell Hooks talks about when we listen, we create a sense of belonging. But that means that those that are not listened to somehow don't belong. And I think this really rings key, because it's also the realization that oftentimes, and in my experience in talking, for instance, with the artisanal women of Mozambique and other Eastern African countries, it's not easy for marginalized people to even speak, especially if they find themselves in regressive circumstances. So think of crisis, war zones, natural disasters, very kind of the real realities of their day-to-day experiences. And I think listening to becomes an act of authorization for those that are speaking. And this really impacted my research over these past few months. I think, well, Bell Hooks also, well, I'm going to read what she said, or what she wrote, because on the other hand, she also talks about the potential of the margin and the position of the margin. So she wrote, "The margin is a location that nourishes our capacity to resist oppression, to transform, to imagine alternative worlds and new discourses." And I think this is quite profound, because the margin in this way has the potential to become a radical space for openness and creativity, and imagining questions that we've never imagined before, and finding answers that we would have never found before. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you so much, Zinzi, also for bringing in Bell Hooks' very important voice here. I'm going to Louise. Being a trans non-binary designer, I would love to hear your take on this as well, because I know in your work you're also trying to center a queer a perspective. So I was wondering if you could also reflect on what Zinzi just brought in, also in terms of who are we listening to, and the margins maybe as a radical space or having potential to become a radical space.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I love, first of all, this phrasing that the center is not neutral. We're taught to hold these assumptions about the way the world is, and my research focuses specifically on how this applies to gender. I really turned to this concept from Helen Hester of the Laborio Cubonics collective, Xenofeminism, which is that change must come from the margins because there's knowledges there that cannot be generated in the center. I guess specifically in regards to non-normative gender and fashion, I want to encourage us to rethink how all of us think about gender and the binaries that we're taught in Western culture to hold as universal truths. I love this quote from Ricky Wilchins, who's a queer gender theorist, who talks about our conceptions of third genders or alternative genders as being either strung up between the two poles of masculine and feminine or orbiting them like some kind of errant Sputnik, which is a very evocative image for me. When in reality, I think as queer people, we know that gender is a verb. There's this process of internal interrogation, this deconstruction of self and the subsequent reconstruction of self that is core not only to how we move about the world, but how we generate solidarity with each other. There's an empathy that comes from really undoing yourself down to the bare minimum and then taking the agency to be who you know you actually are. And hold on, my train of thought. Yeah, I would love to see how that plays more into our relation with fashion, because we are currently living in a trend of gender neutral and unisex fashion, because the straight world is assuming that non-normative genders are simply an alternative aesthetic. What people don't understand is that gender is not an aesthetic, especially when you're living in queerness. It is action, it is constant engagement with self, and I think that there's something that non-queer people can also learn from this, especially how it applies to empathy and solidarity.
And maybe a follow-up question, how will starting from people's lived experiences help to practice solidarity in this sense, and what should we learn and unlearn in order to do so?
In terms of the learning and unlearning, I guess when we live from people's experiences, when we learn from people's lived experiences, we need to not just include voices at the table. You know, the problem with this concept of a seat at the table is like who's sending out the invitations. We need a new table entirely. And this is where xenofeminism comes into play, is the people who are experiencing life on the margins, whether it's in terms of race, class, ability, gender. It comes down to listening and letting people on the margins guide the conversation in the first place, not just including their voices. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's a very important point. Yeah. I would like to move to Aurélie in my next question. In our research project, we developed a theoretical and ethical framework in order to think through solidarity in fashion. And you suggested that we would draw upon the work of novelist and philosopher Iris Murdoch, and specifically focus on two key notions in her work. One is the just and loving gaze, and the second one is the notion of unselfing. Could you briefly introduce these ideas?
Yeah, thank you, Daniëlle. First, as a philosopher, I would like to add that I don't see myself as an expert in the work of Iris Murdoch yet. It's hugely inspirational. It has been for our research project. Now, she's most known as a novelist, but she was actually one of the most leading philosophers of the 20th century. She went against the grain of philosophy at the point, right after the Second World War, and perhaps also against contemporary philosophy, because Iris Murdoch wasn't convinced, as many philosophers are, that the morality of something is to be determined on the basis of an action, right, of behavior. She has this famous phrase that it's not that the inner life or the inside, that it's not dark in there, right? Intentions to her mattered, and she said that philosophy has to be able to think that. And then she comes with a very famous thought experiment of the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law has, well, she thinks badly of her daughter-in-law. She finds her childish, she finds her vulgar, but she doesn't act on it. The daughter-in-law, she doesn't know that her mother-in-law thinks about it that way. But the mother-in-law is also an intelligent woman, according to Murdoch. And intelligence, Murdoch interprets as she's able and willing to reconsider her own thoughts, effects, and feelings. And she thinks again, and then she realizes that her daughter-in-law actually isn't childish, but is that she's able to look at the world in a sense of, and see its wonder, that the daughter-in-law isn't vulgar, but refreshingly, yeah, that she has a refreshing look on the world. And what you see happening there is what Murdoch calls the just and loving gaze. The mother-in-law looks at the daughter-in-law on her own terms, in her own light. And this sets a process of moral transformation. It happens all on the inside because you don't see it reflected in action, right? It sets a process of moral transformation that Murdoch calls unselfing. It's a transcendence of the ego that happens there. And what was important to our research project is that Murdoch doesn't see this as happening as something that happens in the relationship only between humans, but also in the relationship between humans and the non-human, living species as well as what we call objects, right? But she is centered, and her work is very much centered on the individual. She also was very reluctant to be involved in any sense of politics at the time, right? In contemporary philosophy, contemporary philosophers and social theorists are taking up her work to see how it plays out in politics, how it can be translated into the collective, right? And that's also something that we've been discussing a lot in the research project. For instance, I remember questions that we talked about, well, for a very long time, such as, and it's more of a rhetorical question, is this just and loving gaze, is it afforded to all groups of society equally? I mean, I think we all know what the answer is. And yeah, these are, I believe, the very important questions that rose up from the reading and the work of Iris Murdoch that we have been discussing. Thank you.
And I remember in our conversations you also highlighted it's not just about unselfing in itself, but also how you unself. Could you maybe reflect a little bit on that, on the process of how should we then unself?
Yes, well, Murdoch herself, for the process of unselfing, what is crucial, as she calls it, the just and loving gaze, but it has to do with her conception or philosophical conception of what she terms love, and love in her terms, on her terms, is attention, right? So unselfing only happens is by an undevoted attention that transcends, that moves away from the ego, a self-forgetfulness. That's perhaps also a beautiful way of putting it. So attention is the key. Attention as love is the key concept within her framework. Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that in as well. We had some very interesting discussions about this within our project, also about the notion of unselfing in itself. And I wanted to invite Cincy to share your reflections, because you've also stressed the importance of how marginalized communities need to go through a process of selfing.
Well, yeah, that was a thought.
Yeah.
I mean, if I understand unselfing in these terms, I think about how, for instance, in the deep ecology that indigenous communities predominantly practice, there's already so much unselfing going on, which comes across so naturally and organically, just their connection with the earth and with each other and with living and non-living beings. So I thought, well, and again, this raises the question of, you know, who ought to be doing unselfing and who ought to be doing more selfing, and perhaps herein lies the disproportion, you know, between the global north and the global south. And again, the idea of perspectives. I mean, yesterday there was also one of the talks of the indigenous communities of Ceará in Brazil, and in their documentary, it was so beautiful to see all of these acts of unselfing towards their community, and how, I think goes in line with what you said, it starts from the individual role being part of the collectiveness. And so what if these kind of communities would benefit more from selfing? And what if in this context, selfing gives us a chance to kind of unlearn, rethink, and reimagine how to be part of a just world? Yeah.
And could you specifically reflect on that based on your experience of working with craftswomen in Mozambique, and share some thoughts on what we can learn from these non-Western systems of solidarity?
Well, I touched upon deep ecology, and the pillars of deep ecology, which I witnessed there and which I was lucky to be part of, is healing, reverence, symbiosis, balance, and evolution. And reverence for me holds key because it really fosters this deep respect of the complex ecosystems that, you know, we are part of and indigenous communities are inherently part of. And I think also about, for instance, how land is treated and how land is owned. With land being owned, you would assume that you have rights. And in Mozambique, I have come to understand that it's not so much about rights, but about responsibilities. And also the whole idea of ownership, that something could be mine and something could be yours. Because there is a sharing of wealth in those communities. And the thought of we have enough if we share really rings key. And I think also in terms of the kind of economies that are happening in this local environment, which are so cast off from kind of the capitalistic notions and are inherently part of the gift economy, which has been practicing for centuries. So this reciprocal relationship that we create with living and non-living beings and materials is quite interesting, looking through the lens of solidarity. And the other thing is also this, at least when I go to Mozambique and when I'm immersed in kind of these rural settings, this re-enchantment with nature and how present it makes you, and how inspired actually by the wonders and kind of the simple things around you, that this could potentially foster the solidarity, that you have more attention and more care to what is around you and what you're actually part of. And perhaps in this way, solidarity could be kind of one of the vehicles of moving us from systems of oppression to systems of transformation and uplifting, perhaps. Yeah.
You mentioned we have enough if we share as a key principle. This in my view, very much relates to the practice of Zomerkamp. So I'm going to Sanne now, who's a member of the Zomerkamp collective, just like Rosanne and Len sitting over there. And also in terms of offering more attention to, I think that's also important to your practice. The non-monetary practices of sharing and exchange that you are developing or exploring. Could you say a little bit about how you approach that together with the Zomerkamp collective? And how are you trying to put this into practice?
Yeah, it's working, huh? Thank you. Yeah, so indeed with Zomerkamp, so Len and Rosanne over there, me over here. Yeah, it's already mentioned a couple of times, also yesterday and also today. Actually, the collective work process is very important. I think it's no coincidence that also the curators are collectives. And I think it's also a way to really work towards like a system that is based on ego or competition or representation, to work towards and actively practice also trying to get to a structure of more affirmation and embodiment and care. And with Zomerkamp, like we internally try to explore this, but also for practicing solidarity, we focused on volunteers, specifically volunteers of State of Fashion. And what we do is, like what we also notice is that all these collective processes, they really ask time, they take time. And I think it's one of the things that we also really need to, when speaking about learning or unlearning, that a certain kind of goal-orientedness needs to be taken out of our system. We're so used to it, but we need to really learn that things take time. And to, when taking this time, we also kind of like were forced to slow down almost. And in this slowing down, I think there's also, well, what you already mentioned, there's a possibility to try to learn to listen to what happens within this process, within these collective processes. I always have to think of like, well, also this taking time, this slowing down, it's not only like something fun or easy, it's also something that we maybe sometimes tough to do, or we need to also, I think one of the things in learning how to become more collective or work more collective, there's also like an attempt to maybe embrace also a certain kind of discomfort. And I think that's also, something that relates to this unselfing. There's a need for maybe it sounds contradictory, but there's maybe first also a need for self-reflection in a way, in order to also, work towards also unselfing or, becoming more collective. So we focused very much on the exchange. So the project is also, and on time. So the project is also called like Giving Time, Making Energy. And we developed a workshop for the volunteers. And it's only like, you could say, in a starting phase. We really would like to develop it further. Because volunteers actually practice in a way already different forms of exchange that are not based on direct individual or financial gain. So we really wanted to also understand what their motivations are, or what lays beyond also volunteering practices. So it was really great to have a workshop with them, and also to understand what also underlying qualities are of like what you give. For example, a volunteer, you could simply say like, you're hosting a space, but you're also making people feel welcome. And there's so much underneath, which is also about gifts and about I think.
you bring in so many important thoughts. I think it's we can respond to it in many different ways. When you spoke about time, I was looking at ArtEZ because it's also been very much part of your work. I don't know if you may want to reflect on the notion of time in relation to this.
Yes, well, I mean, it very much resonated what you said, Sanne, that several of the things we've talked about when looking at from the perspective of social theorists is only possible, of course, is if there is a very radical change in the societal structural conditions of late modernity, which are very much predicated on a constant acceleration, right, which doesn't allow time for all the so many of the things we have been discussing and will be discussing throughout the day. So I think that's also like on an more perhaps macro plane of thought, something that should be at the back of our thoughts at all times. Like how does this all find its position, or will it even find its position within the structural conditions of late modernity?
And it also takes time, I think, to experience embodiment, which is also a key notion that you brought in. And maybe going back to Louise, could you reflect a bit on how embodiment is part of your work?
Yes, embodiment is everything. And I think especially when it comes back to this question of unselving and reselving, the question is always like who needs to unself, who needs to self, and talking about like the center versus the margins, you have this very established dichotomy of object-subject. Subject is the center and object is the margins, and so perhaps actually what is most necessary as we develop these new structures is maybe it's the center that needs to unself and maybe it's the margins that need to reself, because that's what would create equity. Yeah, I had another thought, but
that's I think, a very true statement. Yeah. Maybe one more thing before opening it up. I wanted to highlight in your what you brought in is the discomfort, also the discomfort and embracing the discomfort that also comes with the practice of solidarity. I don't know if maybe any one of you would like to reflect. I think maybe Andrea, I think it came up in our conversations before. I can't exactly remember, but I think that's also a key term. Also the pain maybe that comes with it. Does any one of you want to say a few things about that based on your experience and practice?
Microphone.
I missed the beginning of the question, but I only remember discomfort. Yeah. I do feel a bit of discomfort being here, because I think it's a very weird setting while talking about solidarity. I don't know if this makes sense to end this conversation, but I just wanted to also be honest in that way. But I can relate to the discomfort in the way we have been working with the collective, Not Enough, together with Maria and Marina. As in the workshops we have done, we are always trying to push the boundaries, because I think, maybe speaking personally, I felt like many times the education here will protect you, like we cannot tackle these subjects. And I think it should be completely the opposite. We have to tackle these subjects because we have to create friction in order for things to happen. Yes, that will be my contribution.
Exactly. Shall we open up? I have a couple of more questions that are about looking forward to the afternoon program, but since we have such an interesting conversation about the content, maybe this is a good moment to invite everyone here to jump in.
Yeah, if you want, you can step up and join us in the microphones to ask your question to Daniëlle. I have one question before we hand it over, or we come to you. I have one question. It's more on like a practical sense. There's a distinction within the entirety of the project between theory and practice. How do the two intertwine, or do they intertwine at all, in a sense?
Yeah, it's maybe an artificial distinction. No, we're really trying to bring it together because theory is practice and practice is theory. So we're definitely, I mean, maybe in the structure of the project, sometimes we came together as theorists to develop a theoretical framework together to really deeply explore that. But no, I think we all don't want to make that distinction.
No, no.
Yeah.
No, there's back and forth continuously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I keep hearing a lot of the themes that I think are central within all of the things that I've been hearing. It's kind of like the I dissolving into we. And it's special to me because I was just looking at the floor and thinking about these things, and actually on the floor it says compassion, and it says involvement, it says freedom, it says integrity. And all of these words kind of come into play in everything that I've been hearing from you. So thank you. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question to Daniëlle or any of the other panelists?
Hi, can everyone hear me? Nice to meet you guys, and thank you so much for the panel. I have a question. You've all kind of been skirting around the concept of power, who has power, who does not have power. And I guess I'd like to ask all of you, how can we start transferring the power that we have to the object, the marginalised communities, the people on the outside? And particularly, I'd like to ask you in relation to Indigenous rights and those practices that we value so much. How do we actually bring those to the centre? And did your work explore, I guess, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that because talking about embodied experiences, and I relate to you, Andrea, this discomfort because I am Mozambican and I am here, but at the same time, when I'm there, of course, the context is so different, and it's something I think that Erica de Geef spoke about yesterday about who becomes the hosts. So, for instance, in my practice, I invite designers to come to Mozambique and to work with the women. So the women become the hosts. The women become the ones who lead the workshops and the sessions and kind of determine the pace. And it's very much embedded in their culture. And so talking about subject and object, it's quite interesting what then happens. Oh, but your question brings up so many thoughts because it has so much to do with legislations and the academic discourse, you know, who's part of that discourse, who gets to determine that discourse. Yeah, I wouldn't know where to begin, but, well, at least from my perspective, practicing this BIPOC-led community design practice that I have already allows for so much more than I could if I were here, I guess, physically. But I need this as well to disseminate and to spread and to get allies. So it's always this tension between both, I guess.
I just want to add something that I think is important. And I think we are going to listen to this word a lot today, but I think we have to start by listening because there is no regulation in the word that will switch the power. And I'm saying this because I mentioned this in one of our meetings, but I was once looking at a documentary and there was this community in Brazil saying that they have been resisting by being invisible, and this is how they want to stay. Yeah.
Toton.
Hi, thank you for having me. Can I add a little bit about this topic? I think first and foremost is acknowledgement. If you don't acknowledge that there is the marginalized people or something that beyond the margin, how can you listen? How can you understand? How can you be empathic? And then how can you include them in the margin? So I think a little bit of an acknowledgement is really important, especially from people like me from beyond the world. I'm from Indonesia, and I don't speak perfect English, so maybe I cannot deliver my message clearly, but I think it is important to give a chance to acknowledge first. That's it. Thank you.
We hear you.
And if I could just add on something that I think is very boring and obvious to all of this, acknowledgement, giving, voice, listening is all incredibly key, but at the end of the day, my question is always who is profiting, especially when we're talking about systems of fashion. Where is the money going at the end of the day? And so when we talk about solidarity and fashion practices as a means of redistributing power, a lot of this, I think, means literally denying your euros or dollars or pounds or whatever to the corporate fashion systems that are decimating this planet. Who you pay your money to for the clothes you wear matters, and when you reinvest in practices, local makers, people who are producing fashion on the margins, you are playing an active role in re-empowering those people, because unfortunately we have not yet escaped late capitalism.
Any other questions or points of reference? So I have another question to Daniëlle, which I'm not allowed to ask by you. Where are we going with this project? And how can people maybe get involved?
No, I thought that was a difficult question, but I wanted to we started so many interesting conversations during the project. I'm so happy that we're having the conversations that we're having today, and also during the other activities of the State of Fashion Biennial. And I just wanted to mention that the research team, or the researchers within the project, we are also working on...
In the mic, please.
The mic.
Sorry, in the mic. We are also working on a new book publication, which will be published at ArtEZ Press with the working title Practising Solidarity, Critical Fashion and Agency That Matters. We have an open call for contributions, which we indeed wanted to launch today during the conference. There are some small folders, one little set over there and downstairs, where you can register for the different sessions in the afternoon program. There are also some folders there if you are interested. So I just wanted to mention that, because also in developing this book publication, we had many conversations. How can we approach that in a solidary way? What is then a solidary process of developing a book, rather than just having one white woman being the main author? So yeah, it's become a collective process, and we wanted to open it up much more. So I just wanted to highlight that. And yeah, we really find it important to offer that space to unheard voices, people that don't necessarily already have an existing platform, and to facilitate a dialogue between these contributors. Also, not only inviting people to share their own contributions, but also inviting them to respond to each other's contributions in their own language or visual language. So I'm actually grateful for asking this question, because I find it important to share this with you. So if you find it interesting to contribute to the book, please come to me or one of us of the research project, or take one of the folders for more information. So you're more than welcome. I would love I love a diversity of perspectives reflected in the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you also to the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.